Welcome back, guys, to our look at World War II, Unit 8. We are now up to the victory in the Pacific. So our last two videos were victory in Europe. Now in these two videos, we're going to look at victory in the Pacific and finish up the war against Japan, and then talk about the legacies of World War II in our final video in this unit. All right, let's figure out how the Allies finally win victory in the Pacific. So let's do a quick review. The Japanese at Pearl Harbor had tried to destroy our Navy in the Pacific to allow them to basically build an empire and then, buy themselves some time, the time it would take us to rebuild our Navy to recapture the territory that Japan would gain. And then we also looked at how the Japanese took over the Philippines in the Pacific in the early stages of the war. And then finally, we looked at this turning point naval battle called the Battle of the Coral Sea, where the Japanese, their advance towards Australia, had been stopped. So that's where we've been. Now we're going to talk about really the most decisive naval battle in the Pacific War, the Battle of Midway. So let's get into those details, and we're also going to look at a land battle called Guadalcanal. Combined, these two battles are going to turn the tide against Japan. So here's the setting, guys. So by the summer of 1942, we are 6 months past Pearl Harbor, and the Japanese really are still racing across the Pacific, gathering up more and more land as their armies advance, and they still look very, very much unstoppable. And we're thinking to ourselves, where will Japan strike next? Where will be their next big attack? And we, through code breakers, we had broken some of the Japanese codes, and we eventually knew that Midway was going to be the next big attack. 'Cause Midway would be a great jumping off point for the Japanese to then attack Hawaii. So we've got to defend Midway. And Admiral Chester Nimitz will be in charge of this strategy to defeat this Japanese movement towards Midway. Now, there's not much to say about Midway because there's really not much there. You can see a couple hundred acres, a little over 1,000 acres. It's basically just big enough to put a couple of airstrips on, and that's why this land is so important, because you can base airplanes there, and airplanes that then could reach out in all directions, maybe even threaten Hawaii. So Admiral Yamamoto, the guy who had planned Pearl Harbor, is hoping that by threatening Midway, what's left of the Pacific Fleet would come out to try to stop them, and there would be this one big climactic battle in which the Japanese would defeat the U.S. Navy, and then from that point forward, Americans would be so disheartened that they would put pressure on their politicians to agree to some sort of peace. The Japanese really, again and again, underestimate Americans in this war. They assume that we're not willing to fight as hard as they are, and that we'll always be looking to get out of the war somehow if they could just strike one big decisive blow against us. Now I want you to imagine you catch an enemy aircraft carrier in this position where their airplanes are loaded up with fuel and bombs on the deck ready to take off. I mean, they are at their most vulnerable in this position. Well, this is the position we catch Japanese planes and aircraft carriers in during the Battle of Midway. So on June 4th, 1942, the U.S. Navy shows up. The Japanese were not really expecting this in full force. It's a surprise to them. We caught the Japanese really by surprise. Many of their planes were still on the decks of their aircraft carrier, and you can see what's going to happen next. By the end of this battle, the Japanese have lost 4 aircraft carriers, 264 planes, over 3,000 men. America loses 1 aircraft carrier, just shy of 100 aircraft, and a little over 300 men. So this is a very lopsided victory in favor of Americans. And of course, Japan, in terms of industry, is really behind the Americans. They don't have the same ability to replace these losses, and so for Japan to lose 4 aircraft carriers is, I mean, absolutely devastating. Whereas Americans, it's sad we lost 1, but we can replace it relatively easily. So this is the major turning point naval battle of the Pacific. From this point on, the Japanese Navy, with a few exceptions, will be basically on the defensive. All right, now let's go on to land. So in that same season, summer 1942, the Japanese are busy building an airfield on an island called Guadalcanal down here in the Solomon Islands. Now, if they're able to finish this airfield, this could then allow the Japanese to launch air attacks against our key Pacific ally, Australia. We cannot let that happen. So we have no choice but to land on the island of Guadalcanal and capture that airfield. And for 6 months, both sides pour in more and more reinforcements. It becomes an absolutely bloody slog of a fight in the rugged, jungly terrain of Guadalcanal. Not a battle we were certainly used to, but we hold our own in this battle. Now, one of the tactics the Japanese learned would not be effective against Americans was called the bonsai charge. This is something that they had used to great effect in their war against China, where basically the Japanese would come out of their trenches and launch this human wave attack. And it was very intimidating. And in many cases, the Chinese would break and run, and they would succeed. The Americans rarely did this. They would hold their ground and just mow them down with gunfire. By February 1943, the Japanese have given up. They pulled back and withdrew from what they called the Island of Death. And if you put Midway and Guadalcanal together in terms of victories, it really does turn the tide of the fighting in the Pacific. And again, you can see the death toll here. This is something we're going to see a lot of in the Pacific War, where Americans are going to take heavy losses and the Japanese are going to take catastrophic losses. All right, now let's talk about our fight across the Pacific. It's called island hopping. So island hopping is this idea that the way we're going to defeat Japan is we're going to leapfrog from island chain to island chain to island chain. Okay, just keep going across the Pacific and eventually jump into Japan. That'll be the final leap, if you will. Now, we're not going to attack every single island. The really heavily defended ones, we're simply going to bypass altogether and only go after the ones we see as absolutely necessary because maybe they have an airfield, maybe they have a port, whatever, that they have to be taken. When the Marianas are finally captured in November 1944, this will put Japan for the first time, really in a big way, within range of our long-range heavy bombers, the B-29 Superfortress. And these are the type of aircraft that, as we talked about in a previous video, are going to rain fire and explosives down on Japanese cities. Now, besides bombers, we have another weapon that would be very effective at weakening the Japanese economy. And remember, Japan is an island nation. They're very vulnerable to submarines. So in World War I and II, we learned how the Germans had used their submarines against the British to try to starve them into submission. We're going to try the same thing against Japan. And our submarines were great at sinking enemy warships and merchant ships. They're also used for reconnaissance, and they could even be used to rescue downed American pilots, including this guy, who happens to be him and him. So this guy, same person, is that guy. And this man will later go on to become President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, who passed away a couple years ago. There he is, World War II veteran. All right, now, as we close in on Japan, Japanese resistance is going to go higher and higher and more fanatical. And a great example of this would be Iwo Jima. So Iwo Jima is this little island right here. I'll show you how little it is in just a moment. It's only about 750 miles away from Tokyo. And we decide this is one of those things we just absolutely have to capture. And the reason we have to capture it are these airfields right here. Okay, so these airfields will be used to land American bombers if they become damaged or suffer engine troubles on the way to Japan or back. They can land at Iwo Jima as opposed to crashing in the ocean and probably dying. Also, by taking this island, this allows us to prevent Japanese airplanes from taking off from this island and shooting down our bombers on their way to Japan. So on February 19th, 1945, we land there. I mentioned it is very small. How small is it? Well, Montgomery County, Tennessee, 544 square miles. Iwo Jima, 8 square miles. Okay, it's a tiny, tiny rock. Again, the purpose of this invasion is to capture this airfield, and these airfields will be used as an emergency landing strip for U.S. bombers as they're flying basically from the Marianas up to Japan and then back. This will also, again, prevent Japanese fighter aircraft from being stationed on Iwo Jima and threatening our bombers as they head to Japan and back. The battle was absolutely brutal. The Japanese had months to dig in, build fortifications, tunnels in the hills, bunkers, all this stuff, and it was a real difficult slog to root out the Japanese because they would fight to the last man. After 35 days, the battle is over. Almost 7,000 Americans died, 19,000 were wounded. The Japanese are going to lose 21,000 approximately. Only 216 were captured, which means the Japanese fought nearly to the last man in this battle. This is a really grim preview of what we're going to see in the rest of the Pacific. So there again is Iwo Jima. If you look right here, Mount Suribachi, that is this right here. And something really important happened on the top of Mount Suribachi during this battle, and that was a flag raising. So this is the first flag raising on Mount Suribachi, and it was recognized pretty quickly that flag was way too small to be seen by a lot of our forces. So a bigger one was needed. So the call came out to send soldiers back down, get a larger flag from one of the ships around Iwo Jima, and then bring that flag back up. And that is the more famous second flag raising at the top of Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi. And this image becomes iconic. It's one of the most famous images of the 20th century. And in fact, the U.S. Marine Corps Monument in Washington, D.C. recreates that moment where the flag went up over Iwo Jima. Now, I want to go back to the picture. This was not at the end of the battle. Okay, this was during the battle, and several of these guys went on to, unfortunately, die in the Battle of Iwo Jima. So it's not the end. It's just our way of saying we're here, and we're going to finish the job. All right, guys. So in this video, we talked about the Battle of Midway, the Battle of Guadalcanal, and the Battle of Iwo Jima. We also talked about island hopping, how we're going to leapfrog from island chain to island chain. And in our next video, we're going to pick up after the Battle of Iwo Jima and talk about the final days of the war in the Pacific.